Tonight we journey to a place that has been forgotten twice. First by time, buried beneath desert sand for thousands of years, erased from human memory so completely that even the peoples who lived nearby had no stories about what lay beneath. And then forgotten again by our modern consciousness, discovered, documented, yet somehow remaining unknown to most who study the ancient world, overshadowed by the pyramids and temples that came later, dismissed perhaps, because it challenges what we thought we knew about when and where and how human sophistication began. We travel tonight to the Nubian desert, to a barren landscape where survival now requires careful preparation, and where the sand stretches in all directions under skies so vast they seem to hold more stars than darkness. Here, in this emptiness, there are stones. Simple stones, you might think at first glance. Rough megaliths standing or fallen, scattered across the desert floor in patterns that could be mistaken for natural randomness. But look closer. Look longer. Let your eyes adjust to what the stones are saying, and you will see they are not random, are not natural, are arranged with such precision, aligned with such astronomical accuracy, positioned with such clear intentionality that they testify to knowledge we struggle to comprehend. These stones remember stars, remember celestial movements tracked across decades or centuries. Remember people who should have left no trace, nomadic cattle herders who moved with the rains and followed the grass and lived lives defined by impermanence. Yet these nomads chose to build something permanent, chose to mark the heavens in stone, chose to create calendar and observatory and sacred center that would endure long after they were forced to abandon it. The place is called Nabta Playa. Playa, a basin where water collects, a seasonal lake that appears during rains and disappears during drought. 7,000 years ago, this was not desert, was instead landscape of scattered lakes and grasslands, of seasonal rains that brought temporary abundance, of herds that grazed and people who followed them. The stones were placed during that wetter time, during what climatologists call the African humid period, when the Sahara bloomed with life that seems impossible when you stand in the desert today. The people who arranged these stones watched the sky with devotion that transformed observation into worship. They tracked the summer solstice, the sun's yearly turning. They marked Sirius, the brightest star, whose rising coincided with seasonal changes crucial to their survival. They built underground chambers where they placed cattle remains in ritual deposits that suggest the animals were more than food, were sacred beings worthy of ceremonial treatment. And then the climate changed. The rains diminished. The grass died. The seasonal lake dried permanently. And the people had to leave. Had to abandon their stone circles and their astronomical calendar and their sacred center. The desert returned. The sand came slowly, grain by grain, year by year, burying the stones so completely that they vanished from sight and from memory. For millennia they lay hidden, waited beneath the sand in silence, waited for someone who would understand what they were, who could read their celestial messages, who could resurrect meaning from burial that seemed eternal. The stones were finally uncovered in the late 20th century, were excavated and studied and measured, were recognized as one of the world's oldest astronomical sites, were acknowledged as evidence that sophisticated skywatching and megalithic construction existed in North Africa thousands of years before the pyramids rose beside the Nile. But recognition has not meant understanding. We can measure the alignments, can confirm they mark solstice and stellar risings with precision that required sustained observation. We can document the underground chambers, can describe the ritual deposits and the architectural sophistication. We can analyze the artifacts, the pottery, and the tools and the cattle bones. But we cannot access the meaning, cannot know what gods these people worshipped, cannot hear the prayers they spoke or the myths they told, cannot understand the cosmology that made skywatching sacred rather than merely practical. We are left with stones and silence, with evidence of devotion and gaps in understanding, with astronomical knowledge encoded in alignments we can verify, but belief systems we can only guess. Tonight we explore this mystery slowly. We'll not rush through the evidence seeking quick answers. We'll instead allow ourselves to dwell in the uncertainty, to sit with the questions, to feel the weight of knowledge lost and the presence of stones that remain. We will stand at the stone circle as the sun rises on summer solstice and imagine the light falling exactly as the ancient astronomers predicted. We'll contemplate the underground chambers and wonder what ceremonies occurred in darkness beneath the desert. We'll trace the alignments to Sirius and ask why this star mattered so much to people who lived before writing, before cities, before everything we associate with civilization. We'll acknowledge the cattle, the sacred animals whose bones rest in ritual deposits, whose welfare may have been the reason for astronomical observation, whose importance justified stone monuments and celestial tracking. We'll witness the abandonment, the climate change that forced the people to leave, the desert that buried their achievement, the forgetting that lasted millennia. Let the evening deepen around you. Let your breathing slow to match the patient rhythms of stones that have waited 7,000 years to be understood. Let yourself drift toward sleep while we walk together through this desert of memory and sand, through this landscape where nomads became astronomers and where the sky was written in stone. The journey begins not with certainty but with wonder. Not with answers, but with questions that the stones whisper across the silence of ages. Who were these people? What drove them to track the heavens with such precision? What knowledge have we lost that they possessed? The stones wait in the desert, holding their secrets, and we approach them now with the reverence they deserve, with the recognition that some mysteries are not problems to solve, but are invitations to wonder. The stones of Nabta Playa, the desert observatory, the calendar written in megaliths, the sacred center that predates pharaohs, all waiting for us in the darkness where memory and starlight dwell. Stone's beginning stretches back 7 millennia into a past we can barely imagine. There is only emptiness. The Nubian desert spreads in all directions, hostile to human presence, marked by nothing except sand and rock, and the occasional acacia tree twisted by wind into forms that suggest suffering made botanical. The heat during day is overwhelming. The cold at night is penetrating. Water exists only in calculations of how much you brought and how carefully you must ration it. This is not landscape that invites exploration, is not place where you wander hoping to discover something interesting, is instead territory you cross as quickly as possible or avoid entirely, is space that pushes humans away rather than drawing them in. But beneath the sand there are stones. Have been stones for 7,000 years, though for most of that time they were invisible, were buried under accumulations of sand that hid them as effectively as if they had never existed. The stones are megaliths in the archaeological sense, are large rocks, some weighing tons, that were moved and positioned by human effort for human purposes. They are not carved into statues, are not inscribed with texts, are not decorated with reliefs showing gods or kings or battles. They are simple forms, are rough stones that retain the irregular surfaces that natural stones possess. Yet they are arranged, are positioned according to patterns that astronomical analysis reveals were deliberate, were calculated, were designed to mark celestial events with precision that required sophisticated understanding of how the heavens move. The discovery came late in the 20th century, came through accident as much as through intention. Archaeologists working in the region noticed something anomalous, investigated, began to uncover stones that appeared to be arranged in non-random patterns. The excavation was painstaking, required removing sand carefully to avoid damaging what lay beneath, required documentation and photography and measurement, required bringing in specialists who could analyze the alignments, who could determine whether the patterns were significant or coincidental. The analysis revealed what should have been impossible, revealed that these stones formed astronomical calendar, that they marked the summer solstice with exactitude, that they aligned with Sirius at a specific moment in that star's precessional cycle. that they testified to astronomical knowledge that predated anything similar in the ancient world. Who created this? The archaeological evidence suggests cattle herders, suggests nomadic pastoralists who moved with seasonal rains, who followed grass, who lived in temporary camps rather than permanent settlements. We know they had cattle because the site contains cattle bones in contexts that suggest ritual rather than dietary use. We know they made pottery because ceramic fragments survive in the archaeological record. We know they valued this place enough to invest enormous effort in moving and positioning stones that weigh hundreds or thousands of pounds. But we do not know their names, do not know what language they spoke, do not know what they called themselves or what stories they told or what gods they worshipped. They have left us stones and cattle bones and broken pottery, have left us evidence of astronomical knowledge without explanatory texts, have left us mystery encoded in megalithic alignments. The stones remember what their builders could not preserve in any other form. Remember the sky as it appeared 7,000 years ago. Remember which stars rose where and when. Remember the summer solstice sunrise and how its light fell across stones positioned to receive it. The memory is not conscious. Stones do not think or recall in any sense we would recognize. But the memory is real nonetheless, is embedded in the positions and alignments that preserve astronomical information as surely as any written record. Perhaps more surely, because stone endures where papyrus crumbles and clay tablets break, and even inscriptions erode. The stones have outlasted the people who placed them, have outlasted the climate that made their placement possible, have outlasted memory and tradition and every oral transmission that might have explained their purpose. But they have not outlasted their own testimony, have not lost the information encoded in their arrangement, still speak to those who can read astronomical alignments, still communicate across 7 millennia. We stand before these stones now stand in imagination, for the site is remote and access is restricted, and most who hear this story will never visit physically. We stand before them and try to comprehend what they represent. Try to imagine the people who moved these massive rocks across desert landscape, using only human and perhaps animal power, using only the simple technology available to Neolithic pastoralists, using only the organizational capacity of nomadic peoples who had no centralized authority or permanent institutions. The effort required was enormous, would have demanded coordination across extended kin groups or tribal alliances, would have required planning and execution sustained over seasons or years, would have needed specialists who understood astronomical principles well enough to determine where stones should be placed to mark celestial events that would not occur until the construction was complete. Why invest this effort? The practical answer points to calendrical utility, knowing when seasons would change, when rains would come, when to move herds to optimal grazing. But practical necessity alone seems insufficient to explain the scale of the endeavor, seems too limited to account for the precision of the alignments or the permanence of the construction. There must have been something more, something that made skywatching sacred rather than merely useful, something that transformed astronomical observation into religious practice, something that made these nomads choose to build lasting monuments despite living lives defined by impermanence. We cannot know with certainty what that something was, can only recognize that it existed, that it motivated achievement we can measure and document but cannot fully explain. The stones remember stars, remember celestial movements tracked with devotion that transformed observation into worship. Remember people who watched the sky as though heaven held answers to questions we have forgotten how to ask. The megaliths stand or lie fallen where time or vandalism has toppled them and continue their silent testimony. Continue to mark alignments that still function 7,000 years after their creation. Continue to demonstrate that sophistication and knowledge and astronomical capability existed long before we thought they did, existed among people we might have dismissed as primitive, existed in forms that challenge our assumptions about when and where and how human intellectual achievement emerges. The stones that remembered stars, the megaliths that hold celestial knowledge, the monuments that whisper across millennia about skywatchers whose names we have lost, but whose devotion left marks we can still read. The stones, the memory, the stars, all waiting in the desert where forgetting and remembering merge in aligned megalithic silence. Covers nearly everything. Before the barrenness that defines this landscape in our time, there was water. This seems impossible when you stand in the Nubian desert today, when survival depends on water you bring rather than water you find, when the heat reflects off sand and rock, creating mirages that promise water but deliver only disappointment. But the impossibility is recent, is condition that has existed for only 5,000 years, or so less than half the time since the stones were placed. 7,000 years ago, when the megaliths were being arranged and astronomical observations were being encoded in their positions, this was not desert, was instead landscape transformed by what climatologists call the African humid period, was time when the Sahara received regular rainfall, when grasslands stretched across what is now sand, when lakes formed in lowlying basins and rivers flowed during rainy seasons. The place is called Nabta Playa. Playa is Spanish word adopted into English to describe a particular geographical feature, a basin where water collects during wet periods and evaporates during dry periods, leaving flat, salt-encrusted depression that serves as temporary lake when conditions allow. At Nabta Playa, the basin is substantial, would have held significant water during the African humid period when seasonal rains filled it repeatedly. The lake would have appeared during rainy season, would have transformed the basin from dry depression into expanse of water that drew animals and the humans who hunted or herded them. The lake was seasonal rather than permanent, would expand during rains and contract during dry months and perhaps disappear entirely in particularly arid years. But for several thousand years, during the height of the African humid period, the lake was reliable enough to serve as focal point for human activity. We imagine the lake in its fullness. Imagine standing at its edge during rainy season when water has accumulated to its maximum extent. The surface is still, reflects sky with such clarity that distinctions between above and below blur into unified field of blue. The reflection is not mere visual phenomenon, is theological statement, is demonstration that earth can hold heaven, that the celestial realm can be encountered in terrestrial form, that looking down into water allows contemplation of what lies above in sky. Ancient peoples across cultures have recognized sacred quality of reflective water, have understood that lakes and pools and still water surfaces create thresholds where different realms meet. At Nabta Playa, this meeting would have been particularly powerful. The desert sky, unobscured by trees or mountains or humidity, would have offered celestial display of unusual clarity, and the lake would have doubled that display, would have created situation where sky existed simultaneously above and below, where stars could be contemplated in their heavenly positions and in their liquid reflections. The people who came here were pastoralists, were cattle herders who moved with seasonal patterns, who followed grass and water, who lived in rhythm with environmental cycles rather than trying to control or transcend them. These were not farmers cultivating crops in permanent fields, were not city dwellers supported by agricultural surplus, were nomads whose survival depended on mobility, on knowing when and where to move, on reading landscape and weather and seasons accurately. Yet here, at this seasonal lake, they chose to create something permanent, chose to arrange stones that would remain after they moved on, that would mark this place as significant across years and generations, that would testify to knowledge and observation that transcended any single group's temporary occupation. What made this lake sacred? Water alone does not explain it. Other playas existed in the region during the African humid period. Other seasonal lakes would have provided water and grass, and the resources that pastoralists required. But Nabta Playa became the site of megalithic construction and astronomical observation in ways that other similar locations did not. Something about this specific place mattered. Perhaps it was geographical, perhaps the basin's position made it particularly accessible or central to migratory routes. Perhaps it was astronomical, perhaps the horizon here allowed particularly clear observation of celestial events that mattered to these skywatchers. Perhaps it was experiential, perhaps the quality of the lake's reflection, the way it held stars and made heaven touchable, created sense of sacred presence that other locations lacked. Or perhaps the causation ran the opposite direction. Perhaps the lake became sacred not because of inherent qualities, but because of human decision, because at some point, for reasons we cannot recover, these pastoralists chose this place as ceremonial center, chose to gather here for purposes beyond mere survival, chose to mark this location with permanent stones that transformed ordinary landscape into sacred geography. Once that choice was made, once the first stones were positioned, and the first astronomical observations were encoded, the location would have acquired significance that reinforced itself, would have become the place where people gathered to observe celestial events, to conduct ceremonies, to maintain traditions that connected them across generations, would have become sacred because it was treated as sacred, because human devotion accumulated there, because the stones themselves became testimony that demanded respect and continuation. The lake held the sky in its still surface, held stars and sun and moon in liquid mirror that made celestial realm accessible to earthly contemplation. We imagine the pastoralists gathering at the lake's edge during significant astronomical events, gathering during summer solstice to watch sun rise in alignment with positioned stones, gathering when Sirius first became visible before dawn to mark the star's return and the seasonal changes it heralded. We imagine them seeing stars both above and below, seeing heaven duplicated in water, understanding the lake as threshold where different realms met. The water is long gone now. The lake dried permanently 5,000 years ago when the African humid period ended and the desert returned. The basin that once held water now holds only sand, but the stones remain. The megaliths still mark the alignments, still testify to the sacred quality this place possessed when water reflected sky and nomads watched heaven with devotion that transformed landscape into temple. The lake that held the sky, the water that mirrored stars. The sacred basin where earth and heaven met in stillness. all gone now except in memory preserved in stones. The lake, the reflection, the meeting of realms, forever remembered in megalithic alignments that outlasted the water, forever held in stones that still mark where sky touched earth through medium of still water that has long since vanished into desert air. Perhaps scattered bones and broken tools, and the kind of fragmentary evidence that allows archaeologists to say, people lived here, without being able to say much about who those people were or what they did beyond the basics of survival. Nomadic pastoralists typically leave minimal archaeological signature. They move frequently, build temporary shelters that decay quickly, create few permanent structures. Their way of life is defined by mobility, by traveling light, by not accumulating possessions or building monuments that would tie them to specific locations. When they die, their bodies are buried or exposed, and the bones scatter, and within generations, even the memory of specific individuals fades into generalized tribal or clan identity that loses personal particularity. But these herders did not disappear, did not leave only minimal traces, did instead something extraordinary, created permanent architecture, established astronomical observatory, demonstrated knowledge of celestial mechanics, sophisticated enough to predict astronomical events, and encode that knowledge in stone alignments that have preserved it across 7 millennia. These were people who should not have built monuments, should not have invested the enormous effort required to move massive stones and position them with astronomical precision, should not have had the organizational capacity or the specialized knowledge or the motivation to create what amounts to Neolithic observatory. Yet they did all these things, left evidence so substantial that we cannot ignore them, left monuments that force us to reconsider what nomadic peoples were capable of achieving. Who were they? We know almost nothing about them as individuals or even as a distinct cultural group. Have no names because they lived before writing. Have no detailed understanding of their social organization because they left no texts describing it. Have no direct access to their beliefs because they carved no inscriptions explaining their theology. We know them only through what they left behind, the stones they arranged, the pottery they made, the cattle bones they deposited in ritual contexts. The evidence is material rather than textual, is archaeological rather than historical, is fragments from which we try to reconstruct whole that remains partially hidden, partially inaccessible, partially lost to the forgetting that time imposes. But the stones speak through their alignments, speak through the astronomical knowledge their positions encode. The summer solstice alignment is precise, is not approximate or accidental, but is deliberate marker that would have allowed prediction of the solstice, with accuracy sufficient for calendrical purposes. Creating such an alignment required understanding solar movements across the year, required observing where the sun rose on different days throughout the seasons, required tracking this over years or even decades to distinguish true patterns from random variation, required knowledge that could not be acquired in single lifetime, but had to be accumulated across generations and transmitted from astronomers who made initial observations to successors who refined and applied them. The Sirius alignment is equally sophisticated. Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky, is impossible to miss once you know to look for it. But knowing that Sirius's heliacal rising the moment when the star first becomes visible on eastern horizon just before dawn, after period of being hidden by sun's glare coincided with seasonal changes, required more than casual observation, required tracking the star's position relative to sun across years, required understanding precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes which stars appear in which positions over millennia-long cycles. The alignment at Nabta Playa was calculated for specific moment in precessional cycle, works perfectly for the period when the stones were placed, would not work for other periods. This specificity demonstrates astronomical knowledge of remarkable sophistication. What drove these nomadic herders to become astronomers? The practical explanation emphasizes calendrical utility. Tracking seasons was essential for pastoral survival. Knowing when rains would come allowed optimal movement of herds. Predicting celestial events provided organizational framework for mobile lifestyle. This explanation has merit, has logic that makes sense, but seems insufficient to fully account for what we see at Nabta Playa. The precision exceeds what practical necessity alone would require. The effort invested exceeds what calendrical tracking alone would justify. The permanence contradicts the mobility that defined their way of life. Something more was happening, something that made skywatching sacred rather than merely useful. Something that transformed astronomical observation into religious practice worthy of monumental construction. Perhaps they believed the stars were gods, believed that Sirius was divine being whose movements influenced earthly events, believed that the sun's yearly journey required human witness and commemoration, believed that understanding heaven's patterns gave access to divine knowledge or divine favor. We cannot prove these beliefs because they left no texts explaining their theology, but the effort they invested suggests that astronomy mattered to them in ways that transcended practical concerns. Suggests that the sky was more than useful tool for tracking time, was sacred realm deserving reverence and careful attention and permanent architectural commemoration. The stones are testament to this devotion, are evidence that these herders counted heaven not merely to manage their herds, but to connect with cosmic order they understood as sacred. We try to imagine them, try to picture the astronomers among the pastoral community, the individuals or lineages, or specialist groups who held astronomical knowledge, who conducted observations, who determined where stones should be placed. Try to imagine the ceremonies that might have occurred at significant moments, the gatherings at summer solstice, the rituals when Sirius first appeared, the celebrations or offerings or prayers that marked celestial events these people had tracked with such care. Try to imagine the transmission of knowledge, the teaching that passed understanding from elder astronomers to younger successors, the stories that explained why this knowledge mattered, the traditions that motivated continued observation across generations. We imagine but cannot verify, cannot recover the voices or the specific practices or the particular beliefs, can only recognize that sophistication existed, that knowledge was present, that nomadic herders counted heaven with precision that challenges our assumptions about who could achieve astronomical understanding. The herders who counted heaven, the pastoralists who watched stars, the nomads who built permanent observatory despite living lives defined by movement, forever anonymous, forever present only through stones they left, forever the mystery of how and why they achieved what they achieved. The herders, the astronomers, the sky watchers, forever counting heaven, forever marking celestial movements in stone, forever the people who should have left no trace, but who left instead monuments that testify across millennia to knowledge we struggle to fully comprehend. Among the various megalithic structures and alignments that archaeologists have documented, one stands apart in its precision and its clear astronomical purpose. A circle of stones. Not a large circle measures perhaps 5 meters in diameter. Not a perfect circle, the stones are rough, and the placement is approximate rather than geometrically exact. But a circle nonetheless. And a circle positioned and oriented with such specific astronomical accuracy that its purpose is undeniable. This is calendar circle. This is where the summer solstice was marked. This is where seasons turned, and the turning was recorded in stone and light. The summer solstice is the moment when the sun reaches its northernmost point in the sky, is the longest day of the year in the northern hemisphere, is the astronomical event that marks transition from spring to summer, from the sun's northward movement to its southward return. For agricultural societies, the solstice has been important marker, has indicated peak of growing season, has provided fixed point in the agricultural calendar, has allowed planning of planting and harvest according to solar cycle. But for pastoral societies, the solstice carries different significance. Marks not the peak of agricultural labor, but the height of rainy season when grass grows most abundantly, when temporary lakes fill with water, when conditions are optimal for herds and therefore for the people who depend on them. At Nabta Playa, the solstice was marked with extraordinary precision. The stone circle was positioned so that on the morning of summer solstice, the rising sun would align with specific stones in the circle, would send its first rays through gaps in the arrangement, would illuminate particular stone surfaces at the exact moment when solar year reached its turning point. The alignment was not approximate, was not close enough, or roughly in that direction, was precise enough that modern astronomical analysis can confirm the circle's solstitial function, can verify that 7,000 years ago, when the stones were positioned, the alignment would have worked exactly as designed. The sun would have risen where the builders expected, would have marked the solstice with clarity that left no doubt this was the moment. This was the turning. This was the day when solar year began its return. Creating such an alignment required knowledge, required understanding that the sun's rising position changes throughout the year, required tracking these changes across seasons to identify the extreme northern point where the sun's rising position stops moving north and begins returning south. Required understanding that this extreme point recurs annually on the same date. Required being able to identify that date with precision sufficient to allow construction of permanent marker that would function correctly year after year. This knowledge could not be acquired quickly, could not be gained through casual observation, required dedicated skywatching sustained across years or decades, required keeping records whether in memory or in some physical form we have not recovered of solar positions on different days, required careful analysis to distinguish true patterns from variation caused by atmospheric conditions or observational error. Who held this knowledge? Who were the astronomers capable of conducting such observations and translating them into architectural alignments? We cannot identify them as individuals, cannot name the person or people who determined where the stones should be placed. But we can recognize that astronomical expertise existed within these pastoral communities, that some people specialized in skywatching, that this specialization was valued enough that the community invested resources in implementing the astronomers' calculations, that the knowledge was transmitted across generations, the observations that established the solstice position were not conducted in single year, but accumulated over extended period, and the stones were positioned to encode understanding that represented collective knowledge rather than individual discovery. The solstice circle transformed time, transformed it from continuous flow into marked cycle. Before the circle, time would have been experienced as succession of days and seasons without fixed points, without precise markers that allowed saying, "Here is where the year turns. Here is where one cycle ends and another begins." The circle created that precision, created annual reset, created moment when time's passage could be acknowledged and commemorated and used to organize the year. The practical benefits are obvious. Knowing the solstice date allowed anticipating seasonal changes, allowed planning movements of herds, allowed coordinating activities across the pastoral community according to shared calendar. But the circle did more than provide practical utility, did more than simply mark time in useful way. The circle created sacred time, created moment when human and celestial realms synchronized, created instant when the sun, whether understood as God or as divine instrument, or simply as the most obvious and powerful celestial body, did exactly what the stones predicted it would do. The alignment was proof, was verification that human understanding of cosmic order was correct, was confirmation that the sky followed patterns that could be known and marked and anticipated, was reassurance that despite the chaos of weather and the unpredictability of rains and the dangers that threatened pastoral survival, the cosmos itself operated according to reliable principles that human intelligence could comprehend. The circle where seasons turned, where the solstice was marked in stone and light, where human knowledge and celestial reality met in alignment that has functioned for 7,000 years. The stones still stand or stood until recently, for time and vandalism have damaged some. The alignment still works. If you could be at Nabta Playa on summer solstice morning, if you could position yourself within the circle and watch the eastern horizon as dawn approaches, you would see what those ancient astronomers saw. Would see the sun rise in alignment with stones positioned 7 millennia ago. Would witness time turning. Would experience moment when past and present merge in light, falling exactly where it was calculated to fall across the vast gulf of time that separates our moment from theirs. The circle, the turning, the solstice marked in stone, forever the place where human understanding met celestial precision. Forever the monument that proves knowledge existed before we thought it could. Forever the calendar written in megaliths. Forever the circle where seasons turn and time begins again. Marked also the stars, particularly one star that shone brighter than all others, that commanded attention through luminosity that made it impossible to ignore once darkness fell, and the desert sky revealed its full glory of celestial light unmarred by any artificial glow. Sirius, the dog star, the brightest star in Earth's night sky, known to later Egyptians as Sopdet, associated with the goddess Isis, connected to the Nile's annual flooding, and therefore to the entire Egyptian agricultural cycle and religious calendar. At Nabta Playa, thousands of years before Egyptian dynastic civilization emerged, before the pyramids rose and hieroglyphs carved divine names into temple walls, stones were aligned to mark Sirius. Specifically, the stones marked the star's heliacal rising. This is technical term from astronomy, but the phenomenon is straightforward. For part of each year, Sirius is invisible from Earth not because the star dims, but because it rises during daylight when its light is overwhelmed by the sun's brilliance. Then comes the moment when Earth's orbit around the sun changes the relative positions enough that Sirius begins rising just before dawn, just before the sun follows it above the horizon. This first appearance after the period of invisibility is the heliacal rising. It occurs on the same date each year or nearly the same, with small variations caused by precession and by leap year adjustments. For ancient astronomers tracking celestial events without mechanical clocks or sophisticated instruments, the heliacal rising of Sirius provided reliable annual marker that could be observed with naked eye and used for calendrical purposes. At Nabta Playa, the alignment to Sirius is as precise as the solstice alignment, is not approximate or coincidental, is deliberate astronomical marker created by people who understood this star's movements with accuracy that required sustained observation. The precision is remarkable, is made more remarkable by the fact that it accounts for precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes which stars appear where over cycles lasting thousands of years. The alignment at Nabta Playa was calculated for the specific period when the stones were positioned. Works perfectly for 7,000 years ago. Would not work for other epochs because precession has changed Sirius's position relative to the horizon. The fact that the builders accounted for this, or more precisely, that they created alignment that functioned correctly for their own time, demonstrates astronomical sophistication we did not expect to find among Neolithic pastoralists. Why Sirius? Why single out this particular star for special attention and permanent architectural commemoration? The brightness provides partial answer. Sirius is unmistakable, is natural choice for any culture developing stellar calendar, because it stands out among all other stars. But brightness alone does not fully explain the attention Sirius received. Many cultures have noted bright stars without creating megalithic alignments to mark them. Something about Sirius's heliacal rising made it significant enough to justify the effort of aligning stones with precision that required expert knowledge and careful construction. The later Egyptian connection to flooding of the Nile suggests one possibility. Sirius's heliacal rising coincided with the annual inundation that made Egyptian agriculture possible. The star's appearance heralded the flood, became celestial sign that warned of coming water and the renewal of agricultural lands. Could the same connection have existed at Nabta Playa? Could Sirius's rising have coincided with seasonal rains that filled the playa and brought grass for the cattle? The correlation is plausible, would provide practical reason for tracking the star, would make Sirius's appearance into crucial marker that predicted environmental changes the pastoralists needed to anticipate, would transform celestial observation into survival strategy. But again, practical explanation seems insufficient. The effort invested suggests something more than utility, suggests that Sirius was sacred, was not merely useful marker, but was divine presence or divine messenger or celestial power deserving reverence. Perhaps they believed Sirius controlled the rains, believed the star's reappearance caused or triggered or signaled the seasonal changes, believed that watching for the star and marking its return was religious obligation as much as practical necessity. We cannot verify these beliefs, cannot access the theology that gave Sirius its significance in their worldview, can only recognize that the star mattered enough to encode its movements in permanent stone, mattered enough to create alignment that has preserved astronomical knowledge across 7 millennia. The connection between Nabta Playa's Sirius observations and later Egyptian veneration of the same star is tantalizing, suggests possible continuity of astronomical tradition, suggests that knowledge preserved in desert stones may have been transmitted somehow, may have influenced the civilization that would emerge in the Nile Valley. The timeline is suggestive. Nabta Playa was occupied during the African humid period, when the region could support pastoral populations. When the climate changed and the desert advanced, those populations had to move. Many moved north toward the Nile, where permanent water allowed continued survival. Could they have brought astronomical traditions with them? Could the Sirius observations that began at Nabta Playa have been carried into Egyptian culture, where they would eventually be incorporated into the religious calendar and associated with goddess Isis? The connection is speculative, cannot be proven through direct evidence. But the parallel attention to Sirius, both cultures tracking this star, both incorporating it into their understanding of cosmic and earthly cycles, suggests at minimum that certain astronomical observations are compelling across cultures and across time. We stand beneath Sirius now in imagination, stand in the darkness before dawn, when the star first becomes visible after its period of invisibility. Watch the eastern horizon where the star will appear. Feel the anticipation that the ancient astronomers must have felt. The moment of heliacal rising is brief, is the instant when the star becomes visible just before the sun follows and daylight erases the stars. But in that instant, in that moment of first appearance, something is confirmed. The cosmic order continues. The star has returned as predicted. The alignment still functions. The stones still mark what they were positioned to mark 7,000 years ago. The alignment that spoke to Sirius. The megalithic marker of the brightest star. The stone testimony to astronomical devotion that tracked heaven's movements with precision that has endured across millennia. Sirius shines. The stones wait. The alignment holds. Forever marking the star that mattered enough to these ancient pastoralists that they encoded its rising in permanent stone. Forever connecting earth to heaven through megalithic precision. Forever the alignment that speaks to Sirius, speaks about the people who created it, speaks across time about knowledge that should have been lost, but that stones preserved. The alignment, the star, the heliacal rising, forever marked in stone, forever testimony to astronomical sophistication, forever Sirius shining above stones that still point to where the ancient astronomers knew it would appear, to mark solstice and stellar risings, the calendar circle that tracked seasons, the alignments that testified to astronomical knowledge. These were only part of the story. Beneath the surface, hidden from immediate view, buried deliberately or buried by time's accumulation of sand, there were chambers, structures carved into bedrock, megalithic constructions underground. These were not natural formations, were not caves that happened to exist and that humans merely occupied, were instead intentional architecture, were spaces created through human effort, through carving and digging and positioning stones with the same care that went into the surface alignments. The discovery of these underground chambers transformed understanding of Nabta Playa, transformed it from astronomical observatory into something more complex, more mysterious, more suggestive of ceremonial purposes we can only partially reconstruct. The chambers vary in size and construction. Some are simple pits lined with stones. Some are more elaborate structures with carefully shaped megaliths forming walls and possibly roofs before collapse. Some contain single large stone positioned upright at center. Some contain multiple stones arranged in patterns whose meaning is not immediately obvious. The variation suggests different purposes or different periods of construction or different groups building according to different traditions. But all share intentionality. All show clear signs of human design. All required effort to create required excavating into hard bedrock in some cases, required moving and positioning heavy stones, required construction that was meant to endure. What were these chambers for? The most common archaeological interpretation proposes ceremonial function, proposes that these were ritual spaces rather than utilitarian structures. The evidence supporting this interpretation comes from what was found inside. The chambers contain cattle remains, not scattered bones suggesting casual disposal of butchered animals, but carefully placed deposits, skulls positioned deliberately, bones arranged in patterns that suggest intention rather than randomness. Some chambers contain complete or nearly complete cattle skeletons, suggesting the animals were placed whole rather than being brought in pieces. The treatment indicates respect, indicates that these were not merely food animals being discarded after consumption, but were subjects of ritual deposition, were beings whose death or sacrifice warranted ceremonial burial or commemoration in specially constructed chambers. The cattle were central to these people's existence, were their wealth and their sustenance, were mobile property that could be moved with pastoral migrations, were the focus of their economic life, and probably their social status system. The more cattle you owned, the wealthier and more powerful you were. Finding cattle remains in underground chambers suggests the animals were more than economic resources, suggests they were sacred, were worthy of ritual treatment, were beings whose relationship to the human community extended beyond mere utility into religious or ceremonial dimensions. Perhaps the cattle were sacrificed to honor gods or to mark important occasions. Perhaps their burial in chambers beneath stone alignments connected earthly animals to celestial powers being marked above. Perhaps the chambers were offerings, were gifts to divine powers in exchange for continued prosperity or protection or favorable conditions for the herds. The chambers create vertical axis, create connection between above and below that complements the horizontal connection between different points on the surface. The stones above mark celestial alignments, mark sun and stars, mark heaven's movements across the sky. The chambers below hold ritual deposits, hold cattle remains, hold evidence of ceremonial practice, hold what may be offerings or burials or commemorations of sacred animals. The surface and the subsurface together create cosmology in 3 dimensions, create architecture that connects heaven marked by aligned stones, earth the surface where humans lived and moved, and underworld the chambers beneath where ritual deposits were placed in darkness. The 3 realms meet at Nabta Playa, meet in stone and ceremony, meet in astronomical alignments above and ritual chambers below, meet in construction that made this place axis mundi cosmic center, where the 3 levels of reality intersected. Some chambers may have held human remains. The archaeological evidence is less clear on this point. Preservation conditions in the desert are variable, and human bones may have decayed more completely than cattle bones. But some chambers contain deposits that could be interpreted as human burials, or at minimum, as spaces intended for human burial, even if the bodies did not survive to be discovered. The possibility of human burial chambers adds another layer to the site's complexity. Adds the suggestion that the dead were placed beneath the stones that marked the stars, that those who had watched the sky in life were buried beneath markers that continued the watching. That death was understood as passage to realm below, while the soul perhaps joined the stars above. The chambers remain mysterious, remain spaces we can excavate and document, but cannot fully interpret, remain evidence of ceremonial practice, whose specific meanings are lost even though the physical remains testify to importance. The chambers beneath the sand, the underground architecture, the ritual spaces carved into bedrock, the deposits of cattle bones suggesting sacred animals, the vertical connection between celestial alignments above and ceremonial chambers below, all adding to the complexity of Nabta Playa, all demonstrating that what happened here was more than astronomical observation, was religious practice, was ceremonial center, was sacred architecture connecting heaven and earth and underworld in stone and ceremony and astronomical precision. The chambers wait in darkness beneath the desert, wait holding their cattle bones and their mysteries, wait testifying to devotion that built not only upward toward stars but downward into earth. Forever the chambers beneath, forever the underground testimony, forever the architecture that connected realms, forever. Or property or economic resources to be managed for maximum utility. The cattle at Nabta Playa were something more, were sacred beings whose importance transcended practical considerations, were creatures whose bones deserve ritual deposition in specially constructed underground chambers, were subjects of ceremony and possibly sacrifice, were central to the identity and the spiritual life of the people who herded them. Understanding the cattle is understanding the people, is recognizing that pastoralism was not merely subsistence strategy, but was way of life that integrated economic, social, and religious dimensions into unified worldview, where the welfare of the herds was inseparable from the welfare of the community and from the community's relationship to divine powers. Cattle bones found in ritual contexts at Nabta Playa are numerous. Are found in underground chambers, in specially constructed deposits, in positions suggesting careful placement rather than casual disposal. Some are complete skeletons. Some are selected bones, particularly skulls, which receive special treatment in many cattle herding cultures. Some show evidence of processing butchering marks that indicate the animals were killed and consumed, though this does not preclude ritual significance. The consumption of sacrificed animals is common in many religious traditions. The eating transforms practical necessity into communion, transforms sustenance into sacrament. The cattle at Nabta Playa may have been both food and sacred offering, may have nourished bodies and souls simultaneously. Why were cattle sacred? The practical importance provides foundation. Without cattle, these pastoralists could not survive. The animals were essential to their existence. Protecting and prospering the herds was their primary concern. But sacredness is more than amplified practicality. Is qualitative shift where the important becomes holy, where the valuable becomes worthy of worship, where economic necessity transforms into religious devotion. Perhaps they believed the cattle were gifts from gods, believed that divine powers had provided these animals, and therefore the animals belonged ultimately to the divine and should be returned through sacrifice or honored through ritual. Perhaps they believed cattle possessed spiritual qualities, had souls or essences that survived death, had connections to divine realm that made them intermediaries between human and divine. Or perhaps the sacredness arose from relationship, from generations of living with cattle, depending on cattle, organizing life around cattle's needs and rhythms. From the intimacy that develops when your survival is completely intertwined with another creature's welfare. The pastoralists would have known their animals individually, would have recognized personalities and temperaments, would have celebrated births and mourned deaths, would have experienced the cattle not as anonymous livestock, but as specific beings with whom they shared existence. The ritual treatment of cattle remains may reflect this relationship, may be acknowledging that these were not mere animals but were companions, were partners in survival, were beings who deserved respect and commemoration when they died. The connection between cattle and astronomy seems strange initially. Seems like combining two unrelated domains, animal husbandry and celestial observation, in ways that don't obviously relate. But perhaps the connection was natural. Perhaps tracking seasons meant tracking when grass would grow for the cattle. Perhaps predicting rains meant knowing when the herds would thrive. Perhaps astronomical knowledge existed to serve the cattle's welfare, and therefore the stars and the animals were two aspects of single integrated concern. The stones above marked heaven's movements. The chambers below held cattle remains. The surface and subsurface together created cosmology where celestial and pastoral were intertwined, where watching stars and tending herds were both parts of maintaining right relationship with cosmic order. Some scholars propose the stone circles themselves represent cattle, propose that the megalithic arrangements are symbolic corrals, are permanent stone versions of the temporary enclosures that pastoralists would have constructed each night to protect their animals. The interpretation is speculative but intriguing. Would mean the calendar circle that marks the solstice simultaneously represents cattle enclosure. Would mean astronomical alignment and pastoral architecture merge in single structure. Would mean the stones encode multiple meanings, are both calendar and corral, are both astronomical observatory and monument to the animals whose welfare the astronomical knowledge served. The cattle that led to temples, the sacred animals whose importance justified megalithic construction, the beings whose bones rest in ceremonial chambers beneath stones aligned to stars, the creatures whose welfare may have motivated celestial observation and whose deaths were commemorated with ritual care. We trace this thread, trace the cattle through the evidence, through the bone deposits and the chamber construction and the possible symbolic meanings in the stone circles themselves. And we recognize that pastoralism at Nabta Playa was not merely economic activity, was religious practice, was way of life that saw sacred significance in the animals upon whom survival depended, was tradition that honored cattle through ritual burial and possibly through building astronomical monuments that served their welfare by predicting the seasons that would bring grass and water. The cattle, the sacred animals, the beings that led to temples beneath the stars, forever honored in stone and ceremony, forever resting in chambers where darkness holds their bones and their mystery. Forever the cattle that were more than animals, that were holy, that were worthy of temples, or directly perceived, can only be measured through changes through sun's movement across sky, through moon's phases, through seasons' progression, through stars' rotation. Ancient peoples developed sophisticated methods for marking time, developed lunar calendars based on moon's cycle, developed solar calendars based on sun's yearly journey, developed stellar calendars using stars' positions and movements. At Nabta Playa, the calendar was written in stone, was encoded in megalithic positions that preserved astronomical knowledge in form more permanent than any written text could be. The stones are calendar, our instrument for tracking time's passage, our monument to the effort invested in understanding and recording celestial rhythms that organized human life. The summer solstice alignment provided primary anchor, provided the moment when solar year reached its turning point. The sun's rising position changes daily throughout the year, moves gradually northward from winter solstice in December through spring equinox in March to summer solstice in June, then reverses and moves southward through autumn equinox in September back to winter solstice. The change is small from day to day, requires careful observation to track. But the extremes, the solstices, when the sun's movement reaches its limits and reverses, are identifiable through sustained observation. At Nabta Playa, the summer solstice was marked with precision. The stones were positioned so that solstice sunrise aligned with specific gaps or surfaces. The alignment provided annual reset, provided moment when time's cycle completed and began again. The Sirius alignment added stellar marker, added celestial event independent of solar calendar. The star's heliacal rising occurred on approximately the same date each year occurred when Earth's orbit brought Sirius back into visibility just before dawn. The rising was observable, was identifiable without instruments, was reliable enough to serve calendrical function. The combination of solar and stellar markers created robust calendar, created system where multiple celestial events could be tracked and cross-referenced, where the solstice confirmed what Sirius's rising predicted and vice versa, where astronomical knowledge was encoded in multiple redundant alignments that protected against error or confusion. Creating this calendar required multi-generational effort, required observing sky across decades to establish patterns with precision sufficient for permanent encoding. One generation might notice that sun rises in different positions throughout the year, might recognize that the extreme positions recur annually. But creating stone alignment that marks the solstice with precision requires more than general recognition, requires identifying exact solstice date, requires determining precise position where sun will rise on that date, requires accounting for horizon features that might affect observations, requires testing and refinement across multiple years to confirm the alignment functions correctly. The process would have required sustained commitment across lifetimes, would have required transmitting knowledge from elder astronomers to younger successors who would continue the observations and refine the understanding. What did the calendar enable? The practical benefits are substantial. Knowing when seasons would change allowed pastoral planning, allowed anticipating when rains would come and grass would grow, allowed coordinating movements across the landscape to optimize grazing, allowed organizing community gatherings around predictable dates rather than uncertain events, allowed creating annual rhythm that structured pastoral life. These benefits alone might justify the effort invested in creating stone calendar. But the effort seems disproportionate for purely practical purposes, suggests that the calendar served ceremonial functions as well as utilitarian ones. Perhaps the calendar established when rituals should be performed, established sacred schedule that organized religious life according to celestial rhythms. The solstice might have required ceremonies, might have been occasion for gathering, for sacrifice, for renewal of relationship with divine powers. Sirius's rising might have marked different ceremonies, might have been moment for offerings or prayers or celebrations. The calendar would have created structure for religious year, would have established when different rituals were appropriate, would have synchronized communities' ceremonial life with cosmic order represented by celestial movements. The synchronization was important, was way of ensuring that human activities aligned with divine rhythms, was way of maintaining harmony between earthly and celestial realms. The calendar also created continuity, created connection across generations through shared temporal framework. The stones would outlast those who positioned them, would continue marking solstice and stellar risings for their children and grandchildren, and descendants extending into futures they could not imagine. The calendar was gift to posterity, was investment in creating permanence that would benefit generations yet unborn, was recognizing that some knowledge is too valuable to be held in single lifetime or even in oral traditions that might be interrupted, was choosing to write time in stone that would preserve the calendar across centuries and millennia. The calendar written in stone, the megalithic encoding of astronomical knowledge, the permanent markers of celestial events, the annual rhythm preserved in aligned megaliths. Forever the calendar that has functioned for 7,000 years. Forever the stones that still mark solstice and still point to Sirius. Forever the timekeeping system that predates cities and writing and everything we associate with calendrical sophistication. The calendar, written not in ink or carved in clay but arranged in stone. The forever marking time's passage, forever preserving astronomical knowledge, forever the monument that is also instrument, forever both memory and measurement, the calendar, in stone, forever. Circles, who aligned them with precision to mark the summer solstice and Sirius's heliacal rising, who buried cattle in ceremonial chambers beneath the megaliths, who created sophisticated astronomical calendar in the Nubian desert they left it all behind. Not through choice, not through conquest or catastrophe or sudden decision to abandon what they had built. They left because they had no choice, because the climate changed, because the rains that had made this region habitable gradually diminished and then ceased, because the African humid period that had transformed the Sahara into grassland and scattered lakes was ending, because the desert was returning. The change was gradual, was not single year when rains failed catastrophically, was instead slow decline over centuries each generation, experiencing slightly less rainfall than the previous, slightly shorter rainy seasons, slightly smaller accumulation in the seasonal lakes. The change would have been barely perceptible within single lifetime, would have been experienced as normal variation some years wetter than others, some years when the playa filled abundantly, and some years when water was scarce. But across generations, the trend was clear. The region was becoming drier. The grass was diminishing. The seasonal lake at Nabta Playa was filling less reliably, was drying sooner after rains ceased, was eventually failing to fill at all. The cattle required grass and water, required resources that the changing climate was making scarce. The pastoralists could adapt to some degree, could range more widely seeking better grazing, could adjust their migration patterns, could reduce herd sizes. But there are limits to adaptation. When grass fails completely, when water becomes unavailable, when the landscape can no longer support the herds, then the people who depend on those herds must leave, must move to regions where rain still falls and grass still grows, must abandon places that their ancestors had inhabited for millennia, must leave behind the stone circles and the astronomical alignments and the ceremonial chambers, must leave the calendar written in stone to function without readers, to mark solstices and stellar risings for no one. The abandonment would have been agonizing, would have meant leaving sacred center, would have meant abandoning place where generations had gathered, where ceremonies had been performed, where relationship with cosmic order had been maintained through astronomical observation and ritual practice, would have meant severing connection to ancestors buried in chambers beneath the stones, would have meant losing the continuity that linked them to the original builders who had positioned the first megaliths and begun the astronomical observations. Some may have hoped to return, may have thought this was temporary displacement, that rains would return, that they could come back to Nabta Playa when conditions improved. But the rains did not return. The African humid period had ended. The Sahara was becoming desert, and Nabta Playa was being claimed by sand. Where did they go? The archaeological evidence suggests many moved north toward the Nile Valley, moved toward permanent water source that could sustain populations even when seasonal rains failed. The movement was probably gradual, was families or clans leaving over years or decades rather than mass exodus in single moment. The movement was probably reluctant, was accepting necessity rather than seeking opportunity, was abandoning home rather than discovering new territory. But the movement was inexorable, was driven by environmental change that human effort could not resist or reverse, was surrender to climatic forces beyond their control. Did they preserve their astronomical knowledge? Did they carry with them the understanding encoded in stone alignments at Nabta Playa? Did the calendrical system and the Sirius observations and the solstice tracking survive the abandonment and the migration? We cannot answer with certainty. The tantalizing parallel between Nabta Playa's attention to Sirius and later Egyptian veneration of the same star suggests possible transmission. suggests that knowledge might have traveled with the migrating pastoralists, suggests that traditions begun in the desert might have been carried to the Nile, where they would influence the civilization that would emerge there. But the connection remains speculative. We cannot trace direct lineage, cannot prove that Egyptian astronomy descended from Nabta Playa traditions, can only note the similarities and acknowledge the possibility. Or perhaps the knowledge died with the abandonment. Perhaps the astronomical understanding was so specifically tied to Nabta Playa to the particular horizon features and the specific alignments constructed there that it became irrelevant in new contexts. Perhaps the calendrical system that had organized pastoral life in the desert was replaced by agricultural calendar, appropriate for Nile Valley farming. Perhaps the ceremonial practices centered on cattle and conducted at stone circles could not be replicated in new circumstances. Perhaps the traditions simply faded as the people who remembered them grew old and died, and the next generation knew only that their ancestors had come from somewhere to the south, but had no detailed knowledge of what they had left behind. The abandonment left no written explanation, left no texts describing why they left, or where they went, or what happened to their traditions. Left only the stones, only the megaliths still standing or fallen, only the chambers still buried or partially excavated, only the calendar still functioning after the calendar keepers had gone. The stones continue marking solstice and stellar risings for no one, continue testifying to knowledge that is preserved in alignment but no longer understood by living tradition, continue waiting in desert that swallowed the lake and the grass and the people who had made this place sacred center. The abandonment that left no answer, the climate change that forced departure, the stones left standing, the calendar left marking time for empty desert, forever abandoned, forever waiting, forever testifying to what was lost when the people had to leave. The abandonment, the leaving, the unanswered questions, forever. Sand accumulates grain by grain, deposited by winds that have swept across the Sahara since long before humans existed and will continue long after we are gone. After the people left Nabta Playa, after the climate changed, and the pastoral communities migrated north toward the Nile or south toward regions that remained wetter, after the seasonal lake dried permanently and the grasslands withered to desert scrub and then to bare sand, the wind came carrying sand, came day after day, year after year, century after century, came and deposited its burden in thin layers that barely mattered in any single day, but that accumulated across years into drifts, into dunes, into covering that slowly buried what had been visible. The stones were covered first at their bases. Sand accumulated around them, began climbing their surfaces, began filling the spaces between them. The calendar circle was gradually obscured. The gaps through which solstice sun had shone were filled with sand. The alignments that had marked Sirius were buried. The surfaces that had received celestial light were covered in grit. The underground chambers filled. Sand filtered down through any openings, through cracks and gaps, through spaces that had been left intentionally or created by time's degradation of original construction. The cattle bones were covered. The ritual deposits were buried under layers that would protect them even as it concealed them. The entire complex surface stones and subsurface chambers, calendar circle and ceremonial deposits disappeared beneath the advancing desert. The burial was so complete that the landscape became featureless, became simply desert, became expanse of sand and rock that showed no evidence of human presence or past occupation. The stones were present but invisible, were there but could not be seen, were testifying but had no audience. The megaliths that had marked celestial events for millennia were buried so thoroughly that travelers passing through the region would have no idea they were walking across sacred ground, were crossing space where astronomical knowledge had been encoded in stone, were treading above chambers where cattle had been buried with ceremony. The desert erased the visibility, made Nabta Playa into nothing, into unmarked location, into empty space, into void where once there had been sacred center. Even memory was erased. Even the local peoples who lived in the region in later periods, the various Nubian cultures and Arab populations that occupied or traveled through this part of the Sahara, had no traditions about the stones, had no stories about ancient astronomers, had no legends about sacred cattle or ceremonial centers. The cultural memory was lost as completely as the physical visibility. The oral traditions that might have preserved knowledge of what lay beneath the sand were interrupted, were lost when the climate changed and forced abandonment, were not transmitted to later populations who moved into region after it had become desert. The erasure was total. Was forgetting so complete that Nabta Playa existed for millennia as nothing, as place that had no history, no significance, no identity beyond geographic coordinates. The forgetting created protection, created situation where the stones were preserved through neglect, were left alone because no one knew they existed, were spared the destruction or appropriation that might have occurred if their presence had been known. The desert that swallowed the ceremony also protected it. The sand that buried the stones also shielded them from weathering and vandalism, and the 1,000 small degradations that exposed monuments suffer. The chambers remained sealed. The bones remained undisturbed. The alignments remained intact beneath their covering. Time weathered the exposed surfaces before burial, but the burial arrested further erosion, created stasis, created situation where the megaliths would remain in approximately the condition they were in when burial occurred, waiting beneath the sand for someone who would excavate with care and interpret with understanding. The waiting was long, was thousands of years, was time enough for Egyptian civilization to rise to greatness and decline, for pharaohs to build pyramids and temples, for hieroglyphic writing to be invented and used for 3,000 years and then forgotten, for Rome to rise and fall, for Islam to spread across North Africa, for European colonialism to come and go, for the modern nation-states of Africa to emerge from colonialism. Through all this history, through all these transformations of human society and politics and religion, the stones at Nabta Playa waited beneath the sand, waited unknown and unregarded, waited holding their astronomical knowledge in alignments no one observed, marking solstices and stellar risings that no one commemorated, testifying to sophistication that no one recognized because no one knew they existed. The desert that swallowed ceremony was not malicious, was not intentionally erasing human achievement, was simply being desert, was following natural processes of erosion and deposition that operate without regard for human concerns. But the effect was erasure nonetheless, was removal from awareness that was as complete as destruction would have been. The stones survived physically but were lost epistemologically, were present but unknown, were testimony that no one could read because no one could see. The desert, the sand, the slow burial, the patient covering that protected through concealment, the forgetting that was also preservation, the erasure that maintained what it hid, all working together to remove Nabta Playa from human knowledge while maintaining the evidence that would eventually allow rediscovery. The desert that swallowed ceremony, that buried the sacred center, that covered the astronomical alignments and the ritual chambers, that erased memory even while preserving stones. Forever the patient sand, forever the slow burial, forever the forgetting that protected, forever the desert holding secrets it did not create and does not understand, but that it preserves through the simple act of covering everything equally with drifting grains of ancient stone ground fine by endless time. In the late 20th century, when they began to document the alignments and analyze the chambers, when they started to understand the sophistication of what they had uncovered, one question emerged more insistently than all others. What gods did these people worship? The stones testify to religious practice. The alignments demonstrate reverence for celestial bodies. The ritual deposits prove ceremonial treatment of cattle. The effort invested indicates that something sacred motivated this construction. But we have no names. No texts identify the deities. No inscriptions preserve the theology. No surviving oral traditions transmit the myths. We can see what they did, can measure and document and analyze their achievements, but cannot access what they believed, cannot know the stories they told about the stars they tracked, cannot hear the prayers they spoke in ceremonies we can only infer from archaeological remains. The absence of names creates profound mystery, creates encounter with religion that is simultaneously evident and inaccessible. We know these people had religious beliefs sophisticated enough to motivate megalithic construction. No, they had cosmology that connected cattle and stars and underground chambers into unified sacred geography. No, they had ceremonial practices complex enough to require specialized knowledge and sustained tradition. But we cannot identify the divine beings central to their worship, cannot access the myths that explained cosmic order, cannot understand the theological framework that made astronomical observation into religious obligation. The gods are forgotten. The names are lost. The specific content of belief has dissolved into time's silence. This is not unique to Nabta Playa. Many ancient religions have left physical evidence without textual explanation. Many cultures built monuments whose religious significance we recognize without being able to specify the deities involved. But Nabta Playa's antiquity makes the forgetting more complete. The 7,000 years that separate us from the stone builders is vast gulf. Is time enough for languages to die and be replaced multiple times? Is time enough for entire cultural traditions to emerge and flourish and disappear? Is time enough for forgetting to be so thorough that not even fragments remain in later traditions? Could the gods of Nabta Playa have been proto-versions of later Egyptian deities? Could the solar deity implied by solstice alignments have been early form of Ra? Could the divine presence associated with Sirius have been precursor to Isis Sopdet? Could the cattle ceremonies have honored early versions of Hathor or Apis? The connections are tempting. The parallels between Nabta Playa's astronomical interests and later Egyptian religious practices suggest possible continuity. But the connections remain speculative. We cannot trace direct theological descent, cannot prove that Egyptian gods inherited attributes or associations from Nabta Playa traditions. Can only note that certain astronomical and pastoral themes appear in both contexts and wonder whether coincidence or whether genuine transmission occurred across the millennia that separate them. Or perhaps the gods of Nabta Playa were completely distinct, were divine beings who had no successors, whose worship died with the abandonment, whose names were lost when the climate change forced migration and traditions could not be maintained in new contexts. Perhaps what we see at Nabta Playa is religion that existed complete and self-contained in its time, that had its own theology and mythology entirely separate from anything that came later, that has left physical testimony without cultural continuity. The possibility is sobering, reminds us how much has been lost, reminds us that what we know of ancient religions is tiny fraction of what existed, reminds us that most human religious experience has left no recoverable trace, has vanished into forgetting so complete that we cannot even identify the gaps. The megaliths mark forgotten gods, mark divine presences that once received worship, that once were invoked in prayers, that once were honored through sacrifice and ceremony, and the enormous effort of creating permanent astronomical monuments. The stones testify to devotion without being able to name its object, testify to reverence without preserving what was revered, testify to sacred practice without transmitting sacred content. We stand before these megaliths and recognize holiness in their arrangement. Recognize that these stones mattered religiously to their builders. Recognize that astronomical alignments and ritual chambers and cattle deposits all point toward complex theological understanding. But we cannot complete the understanding, cannot supply the missing names and myths and theological explanations that would make the religion fully accessible. The forgetting is nearly total, is loss so complete that even the outline of their worldview barely survives. We know they honored cattle, the ritual deposits prove it. We know they tracked celestial movements, the alignments demonstrate it. We know they buried the dead, or at least conducted ceremonies that required underground chambers. But we don't know what creation myths they told, don't know what afterlife they imagined, don't know what moral codes they followed, don't know what relationship between human and divine their ceremonies enacted. Don't know whether they believed in one supreme deity or in many gods, whether they believed the stars were gods or were merely ruled by gods, whether they believed cattle were sacred in themselves or were sacred as gifts from divine sources. The mystery is irreducible, is gap that cannot be filled without texts or surviving traditions or cultural continuity that would allow reconstruction. We have stones and bones and astronomical alignments, have physical testimony to religious practice, have evidence that proves sophistication and devotion. But we don't have access to belief itself, don't have the stories and names and theological explanations that would transform archaeological remains into living religion we could comprehend. The megaliths that mark forgotten gods, the stones that testify to worship whose object is lost, the monuments to divine beings whose names have dissolved into silence, forever marking, forever witnessing, forever holding space where gods once were but are remembered now only through absence. The forgotten gods, the nameless divinities, the sacred presences honored in stone but no longer identified. Forever the mystery of who they worshipped. Forever the gap between evidence and understanding. Forever the stones that mark gods whose names we cannot recover. Forever is older than the pyramids by more than 2,000 years, is older than hieroglyphic writing, is older than the temples at Karnak and Luxor and Abu Simbel, is older than pharaohs and dynasties and everything we typically think of as ancient Egyptian civilization. The stones were arranged 7,000 years ago. Egyptian dynastic period began around 3100 BCE, 5,000 years ago. The gap between these dates is enormous. Is 2,000 years is span of time equivalent to the entire Christian era? Is period during which the megalithic circles at Nabta Playa stood, while the civilization that would become Egypt was still developing, was still coalescing from village communities into unified kingdom, that would eventually build monuments we associate with ancient sophistication. The temporal priority matters. Matters because it disrupts our narrative about civilization's development. We tend to assume sophistication emerges gradually, that astronomical knowledge develops slowly, that monumental architecture requires long process of cultural evolution. But Nabta Playa suggests different possibility, suggests that sophistication existed earlier than we expected, that astronomical knowledge and megalithic construction appeared among people we might have dismissed as too simple, too mobile, too early to achieve such understanding. The stones challenge assumptions, force reconsideration of when and where, and among whom intellectual and architectural achievement became possible. Could the astronomical traditions of Nabta Playa have influenced later Egyptian civilization? The question is tantalizing. The parallels are suggestive. Both cultures paid close attention to Sirius. Both incorporated the star into their cosmological and calendrical systems. Both understood the star's heliacal rising as significant event. Both tracked solar movements with precision. Both created monumental architecture that encoded astronomical knowledge. The similarities could be coincidence, could be independent recognition of the same celestial phenomena and the same practical utility of tracking them. But the similarities could also indicate continuity, could suggest that when climate change forced the Nabta Playa communities to migrate north toward the Nile, they carried their astronomical knowledge with them. Could suggest that traditions begun in the desert influenced the civilization that would emerge in the river valley. The evidence for continuity is circumstantial, is based on similarity rather than on documented transmission. We cannot trace direct lineage from Nabta Playa astronomers to Egyptian priests, cannot prove that knowledge encoded in desert megaliths was carried into Egyptian temples, cannot demonstrate that the sophisticated skywatching that created the stone calendar influenced the equally sophisticated astronomical knowledge that Egyptian civilization would develop. We can only note the parallels and acknowledge the possibility. Can recognize that Egyptian astronomy did not emerge from nothing, that it had precursors and precedents even if we cannot identify them with certainty. Can see Nabta Playa as potential source, as place where astronomical traditions may have begun that would later find fuller expression in pharaonic culture. But even if no direct transmission occurred, even if Egyptian astronomy developed independently without influence from Nabta Playa traditions, the desert stones remain significant, remain evidence that astronomical sophistication existed in North Africa long before Egypt's pyramids, remain testimony that Neolithic pastoralists were capable of achievements we had not recognized, remain challenge to assumptions about which peoples and which periods could achieve monumental architecture and complex astronomical understanding. The stones predate pharaohs, predate the civilization that would make Egypt famous, predate everything we know well about the ancient world, stand as witness to earlier sophistication that has largely been forgotten or ignored because it doesn't fit our narratives about civilization's progression. The silence that predates pharaohs is deeper than Egyptian silence. Egypt left texts, left hieroglyphic inscriptions that we can read, left papyri and tomb paintings and temple reliefs that communicate across millennia. Egyptian civilization speaks to us through its written records and its visual art and its monumental architecture. But Nabta Playa predates writing, predates the preservation methods that make later cultures accessible to our understanding. The stones speak only through their positions, through astronomical alignments that we can measure, but that carry no explanatory text, through ritual deposits that we can excavate, but that include no inscriptions describing their meaning, through architectural sophistication that we can document, but that provides no written justification for why such effort was invested. The deeper silence is more difficult to penetrate, requires different methods, requires archaeological analysis rather than textual interpretation, requires astronomical calculation rather than reading inscriptions, requires inference from physical evidence rather than direct access to explanatory texts. The work is painstaking, is reconstruction from fragments rather than reading continuous narrative, is building understanding from material remains that testify indirectly to beliefs and practices that were never written down, and that were lost when oral traditions were interrupted by climate change and forced migration. The silence is not complete, the stones do speak, the alignments do communicate, the ritual deposits do testify. But the speech is muted. The communication is partial. The testimony is fragmentary. We stand in this deeper silence. Stand before evidence that predates the civilizations we know best. Stand among stones that were ancient when Egypt was young. Stand in presence of knowledge that was old before pharaohs began building pyramids. The standing is humbling, reminds us how much we don't know, reminds us that human achievement extends far beyond what we can easily access and comfortably understand. Reminds us that 7,000 years ago, in the Nubian desert, people were watching stars with sophisticated understanding and encoding that understanding in megalithic monuments that have outlasted their creators and their civilization and their traditions and their very names. The silence that predates pharaohs. The earlier mystery. The astronomical knowledge that existed before Egypt. The sophistication that came first, forever older, forever more mysterious, forever the stones that knew stars before the pyramids knew the sun, the silence, the priority, the depth of time that separates us from these anonymous astronomers, forever the silence that came before, forever the mystery that is deeper because it is earlier. Forever Nabta Playa holding its secrets in alignments that predate everything we thought was ancient. The silence, deeper, earlier, forever.